So I'm going to have to do that first part over when I'm done with you, but I'll record the Q&A since I forgot to turn it on. I should have put a Post-it note to myself. Turn on the recorder, idiot. Anyway, you must have questions. You always do. You can unmute yourselves, and I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Does everybody know how to unmute themselves?
Yes, I just did. Tim,
Yes.
this is Shirley Peace.
Yes.
I wondered how in the state when we have mail-in voting and we get our ballot in the mail, what do homeless people do?
You can, that's an excellent question. And from what I've read on the Secretary of State's website, you can designate an address.
Oh.
You have to do something, right?
Like a post office box.
A post office box or some place that's willing to, get your mail for you. So yeah, it is still possible to vote. I believe you can even use your last known address. You just have to have an address somehow. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Good question. Other questions?
No,
Lois?
no.
No?
Very interesting.
No other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh, good.
I have one.
So you,
Me? Okay.
Go ahead.
Would you care to comment on the recent events that have possibly changed the voting profiles and interest in voting?
I presume we're talking about all the protests.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, clearly racism is still a big issue in this country, and as I tell my students, I am the very definition of white privilege, right? We did a workshop once and they said, what challenges did you face in coming to college? And I thought about it and I thought, no, I had no challenges in coming to college. My father went to college. I mean, from the time I was literally 5 years old, I knew I was going to go to college. And when I got to college, failure was simply not something I ever even considered. I just know I had to keep going and find a way to get through. And that is not the circumstance that everyone in this country faces, right? At Highline, we get so many students who are literally the first person in their entire family to go to college. And it's a great thing when they finish and they get a degree and they go on either to a career or another degree. But those folks face challenges that I can only observe, right? And that's something that we have to work on. Well, that problem is much broader. Many people in this country still judge other folks by the color of their skin. I learned today that our college president, Dr. John Mosby, is a great guy, happens to be African American, and he has been called the N-word more than once in our state, which just shocks me. I'm just like, join the 20th century, if not the 20th first here. I mean, these are just folks. So in any case, the challenges that people face in this country because they are not treated the same have sort of reached a boiling point. And one of the things that seems to be doing is motivating larger numbers of white voters to take this issue seriously. And the president has usual knack for saying all of the wrong things at the wrong time. Basically saying, states should call out the National Guard and open fire on people. That's clearly not going over well with all kinds of folks. So that issue is rearing its head in the elections. Now, it will convince some people not to vote for the president. The people who are going to vote for him anyway probably still will. Although clearly I'm hearing from otherwise conservative people that they're not comfortable with his response to all these issues. So that may change some votes. There's a small but growing dump Trump movement among Republicans who are not at all comfortable with almost anything that he's doing. Which you may disagree. I personally find encouraging, although part of me wants to say, if you look at what your party's been advocating for the last 40 years, Trump is simply the culmination of the politics that you've been practicing, demonizing the poor and people of color, going all the way back to Ronald Reagan. On the other hand, once again, with young people, it's harder to say whether it will motivate them to vote in larger numbers. Since the young people I often talk to or hear from still don't seem to understand elections and aren't convinced that people should vote. I may have shared this story with you before. I went to a workshop in December. It was an all-day conference, and one of the panels was young people and politics in Washington State. And my first thought was, I'm really old, aren't I? Because this was people under 30. But this young woman who'd run for county council against her prior mentor, who was in her 70s, and lost, didn't get 25% of the vote. I mean, she got stumped. And so she's on this panel, and she said a couple of rather amazing things. She did say, well, generations need to listen to each other. I'm like, yeah, of course, that's good. And she says, but baby boomers need to understand they don't have all the answers. And my first thought was, I know damn well I don't have all the answers. And I think that's the difference between me and you, girlfriend, is that I know that. I'm not sure that you do. And then she said more than once, I'm not sure that voting is always the best way to get things done. I'm thinking, what are your alternatives? That's a little scary. So this disaffection with the system, while it's certainly understandable and probably warranted, if it equals those folks not voting, nothing will change. Nothing will change. So that's the unanswered question. Will this motivate younger people to vote? Older people, I think, are more likely to vote, as usual, and vote in a particular way, since the overwhelming majority of Americans, including Republicans, say, racism is a serious problem. Here's something we need to do something about, and they don't like the way the president is handling it. So.
Question?
So it will have an impact. How deep an impact, I'm not sure at present. So good question. Other questions?
Question? Do you hear me?
Yes.
What methods are used to promote gerrymandering?
Well, so here's how this works in a lot of states, right? You have in 2010, okay? You had in almost all the states, state legislative elections, all right? And one party gets a majority in the legislature. They are then in control of redistricting. And because in 2010 we had a census and the electoral districts all have to be within 1% of population, you have to redraw the boundaries to accommodate changes in population over the previous 10 years. And so if you have the majority and you're so inclined, you can then redraw the districts to advantage your party and hurt the other party. So that's how that happens. It happened a little bit here with the 8th congressional district, which was the one that the former King County Sheriff Dave Reichart occupied that seat, and they kept adding Eastern Washington district areas to that district to sort of make it more Republican. And then in this last election, a Democrat finally won. Kim Schreier, she beat Dino Rossi. This time, as we'll talk about a little bit in 2 weeks, it doesn't look like the Republicans are putting forth a particularly strong candidate to oppose her. And in any normal year, I would expect that she'd still be vulnerable. Given that there's a little bit of gerrymandering there, if we look at the state as a whole, it's not anywhere near as severe as it is in other states. So we don't tend to have districts that look like salamanders. So, but it's up to the states how they decide to do that. States actually have a lot of control over elections, and that's provided for in the Constitution.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Other questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Can you explain what vote harvesting is and what is being done in this state to prevent it, since we have a mail-in service?
Yeah. Well, the idea behind vote harvesting is that people are going out and convincing people to fill in their ballots and then making sure that they get mailed in or get delivered to voter drop boxes. It's not illegal, right? I mean, if you and all your friends got together and decided you were going to look at the ballot together and vote, and then somebody was going to take it to the drop box, there's no law that says you can't do that. I happen to think that vote harvesting is yet another smokescreen for, trying to get poor people and people of color keep them from voting. I've heard of a few instances in, like, say, SeaTac, where you have, for example, large Somali population in SeaTac, and folks there in the community will encourage folks to vote, and they may organize a get-together and say, all right, we're all going to vote. We're going to make sure we get our ballots in. That's not against the law. As communities get more settled and get wealthier, that kind of thing tends to happen less often. And there's not widespread evidence that this is somehow tipping elections one way or the other. It's simply an effort to get people out to vote. I've not seen any evidence. No one has said, other than making accusations, that people are showing up and filling out other people's ballots and mailing them in for them. There's no evidence that happens. Like I said, there's so little evidence of voter fraud. So, for example, in Pennsylvania in the last decade, the Republican legislature passed a voter ID law. It was challenged in court. The court threw it out because the Pennsylvania Republicans, in defending the law, could show no instances of voter fraud. And since there was no voter fraud, there was clearly no need for this law. So,
I have a test your memory question.
you'll win, but go ahead.
Where was Kilroy in 1940?
Where was Kilroy in 1940? Well, that was actually before I was born. He hadn't gone to war yet, so I'm not sure. Where was Kilroy?
Kilroy was here.
Kilroy was here.
It's written everywhere.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yes. Yeah, the echoes of that were still around when I was a little kid, and there were people I'd met who were World War II veterans and knew something about it.
Actually,
Yeah,
Kilroy appeared to be a mystical inspector that welders had to have check their work.
I want to do some research on that. That's an interesting one. That spurs some distant memories.
I had to stir up the memory of what Kurt Kilroy's name was.
Yeah,
I couldn't remember, but I knew he was here.
He was here. That's right. That's right.
I met a man that was not here, and I wish he'd go away.
Yeah. Other questions?
I have a question. Do
Sure.
you know of an easier way or a better way to choose judges?
Better way to choose judges. That is a fascinating question because as I'm sure we've talked about before, in many ways, this is one of the most important offices you could vote for. And yet it is, judicial candidates are the ones about whom we're likely to know the least. All they can talk about legally is their qualifications and things, Fred Dorr, who was once on the Supreme Court, one of the first guys to sort of actively campaign. I remember his TV ad, and he's sitting up there in a robe with a gavel saying, he's tough but fair. I mean, that's what they can say, right? So in some states, they have judicial commissions that appoint people. The governor may appoint people, and they must be confirmed by the legislature. I mean, there's really no sort of perfect system. I don't think it would make it better to let them campaign about how they'd rule on an issue, because I mean, they're supposed to decide cases based on the facts presented before them, not because they have a preconceived notion about something. If you look at the voters pamphlet and you see who's endorsing them, that can sometimes give you a clue as to which way a judge might be leaning. In the last election, voters in Washington State sort of always surprised me at just how smart they are. I mean, you would think they don't know, right? But we had Stephen Gonzalez running for re-election to the state Supreme Court, fairly well regarded. And then this other guy comes along, Nathan Choi, and he was campaigning actively. He'd been disbarred in Hawaii. He, in one interview, admitted that he didn't really know much about Washington state law. His legal practice didn't go in that direction. Clearly unqualified, referred to himself as Judge Choi, even though he'd never been a judge. And there was a lot of fear that he would somehow still win. Gonzalez won handily. So as imperfect as the system is, it seems to work much of the time. And indeed, on occasion, we have judges who turn out to be not all that great, and they will get unelected. You may remember, oh gosh, what is her name? Jeanette Burrage, who was a local judge after having served as a legislator. And she said, among other things,
Every
that
button I can punch, and
women attorneys needed to wear dresses when they appeared in her court. That didn't go over very well, and in the next go around, she was unelected. So,
Why did you go to?
I selected this microphone right here, but the sound is muted.
Other questions?
I didn't even know mine would make a sound, so I've never used it.
Yeah, right here, right on this button.
All right. Other questions?
I have one.
Sure.
Do you think there's the possibility that there will be an alternate Republican nominee?
I don't know. If you were really serious, if you were a Republican and you really didn't want to see Trump reelected, the danger of running a third-party candidacy is that it would likely draw votes away from Joe Biden. So while you may not like Biden, if you like Trump less, then drawing away votes with a third-party candidacy would seem to be
I think there is some.
counterintuitive. So
I have in mind, I didn't ask it clearly, we saw Mitt Romney in the demonstration.
yeah, I don't.
He would be the nominee other than Trump.
Yeah, I think the Republicans will easily renominate Trump. They have decided for whatever reason that their fortunes are tied with his. I gather privately many of them are unhappy with him, but they're very afraid of him. because he keeps going after people in nasty ways who disagree with him. And of course, his base is pretty rabid. So it's unlikely that those folks will stand up to him. And certainly some of them are doing well under his administration. I'm amazed at the number of people who trust Trump to manage the economy better, because for most Americans, the economy's not better. For the richest Americans, yeah, it probably is. So, but still, there are people who like him for what are at least rational reasons. Great majorities of both parties don't think he's better at handling the racial issue, and a lot of people are obviously unhappy with his response to coronavirus. Yes.
One more little question.
Sure.
Do you think he has a mental problem?
That's a theory that I've heard, that some people think he really has some issues there. I don't know. It's possible. It was a picture of the way he often stands, and they said, well, this is indicative of a certain kind of dementia. I don't know if that's true. I mean, he's not really behaving differently than he has for most of his life. He's had problems with race. He's had problems with honesty. He did poorly by so many people who worked for him, contractors, who would just get stiffed at the end of doing a job for one of his properties or another. He's gone bankrupt multiple times. I think it's pretty iffy that he won't release his tax returns, and one wonders whether that's because either he's not as rich as he claims, or that he's got money unaccounted from various sources. I mean, one of the theories is that he's been able to remain where he is in the business world because he took money from the Russians. I don't know if that's true, but it's not an implausible suggestion.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? All right. Well, you're letting me off easy here. Well, in 2 weeks, at this time on Thursday, we will talk about the federal elections. We have some very interesting congressional races in this state. In the 10th district, which is just south of us, there are 19 people running for Congress. And we'll talk about how we got so many candidates on the ballot this time. It has something to do with coronavirus. And then 2 weeks after that, we'll talk about the state elections, including all 37 people running for governor. So it's going to be a very, very long primary ballot that you'll see. Most of them are not serious candidates, but actually, if you add in lieutenant governor candidates, effectively, that makes 48, 49 people who are effectively running for governor. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a few weeks. So, all right. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to stay on here so I can record the part of the presentation that I didn't. I'm so sorry. But you'll get the whole video, Doug. It'll just be in reverse order.
Thank you, Tia.
Yeah, my sticky note next time. Got to put a sticky note up to remind myself. So,
all right.
Thanks, everybody. It's lovely to be with you again. I'm glad you all seem to be well. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you, Tia.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Doug. All righty. I'm going to start my recording. recording again. You can stay on or log off as you wish. So this week we're talking about who votes and who doesn't and why. And then we'll start with the basics, and some of this probably most of you know. To vote in Washington State, you have to be a citizen, legal resident, and that takes 30 days before an election to become a legal resident. So at least 18 years old by election day. That's one of the reforms of the last couple of years, that people who are 16 years old can pre-register, and they will be eligible to vote when they turn 18, so they don't have to wait to register. It's made a difference when we do voter registration at the college. We're able to get a lot of younger students more interested in that. So not disqualified from voting due to a court order, not under Department of Correction supervision for a state felony conviction. It is possible to get your voting rights back after that has happened. Takes a little work. That's something the legislature, I think, may address in the coming session. So some other states make that easier. Residency requirements, as we said, 30 days. You can only be registered to vote in one location, even if you have multiple residencies. But if you move away, you're still registered to vote in Washington State until you register someplace else. Your address stays the same until you change it. You may use a different address for your mailing address, so it is possible to get a vote if you are effectively homeless. If you're a U.S. citizen living abroad, even if you move out of state, you can still vote. So it's easy to register to vote. You go online, vote.wa.gov, takes about 3 to 5 minutes. The real trick seems to be getting your voters your ID number or your driver's license number down exactly right. It's not a terribly forgiving system, understandably, and they let you do this because it's effectively, if you have a state ID card, they have your signature on file. You can print a form, go to their website, you can mail that in up to election days. You can do that up to a week before election. On election day, you can go to any county elections office and register to vote. Our local one is in Renton, so if you live in South King County, that's fairly handy. So turnout, who votes and who doesn't? So we see here, this is a pattern that shows up across all elections, our state and others. We have peaks and valleys, and the peaks are presidential elections and congressional elections. The valleys are local elections, which have the lowest turnout historically. And that's true over time, without fail. And which is too bad, really, because local elections, I always argue, may be in many ways more important to an ordinary person than what happens at the state or the federal level. I mean, you know, this is your town, right? Your school district, whatever it is. Those are the things that are happening in your neighborhood. My younger students take state and local government. They're uniformly amazed to realize how important their local governments are. So it's too bad. There's some move afoot to move those all elections to even numbered years. It would increase turnout. It would be harder for local candidates to sort of get attention and get traction, because if we're all paying attention to Congress and the legislature or the presidency, how much attention then are we spending on local government elections? In some counties in Washington State, in fact, most, their countywide offices are on even numbered years. And so they're going to get slightly higher turnout. But we find that in long ballots, and we already have like the longest ballots on earth, the longer the ballot, the more people sort of not vote, stop voting lower on the ballot. So by the time they get to judges, actual votes cast has fallen. And I think the same thing would happen with local government elections. So a trade-off there in any case. Since we've had the top two primaries, still the same pattern. If we look here, we see that in the even numbered years, the turnout's up, and in the odd numbered years, those local government elections, once again, the turnout is down. Down over time, and you know, as the economy got better in the 2010s, people are less likely to vote. Elections are often a referendum on the economy. And then as people began to get more agitated, the Trump years, we see that in 2018, turnout was higher. And as we'll see later, substantially higher, historically speaking. Turnout in US presidential elections, so this is a much longer time cycle. And we see over on the left side, this is early in the history of the country. Well, turnout was fairly low, in part because people didn't know, in part also because there were property qualifications, which made it harder for people to vote. You see the big dip there in 1820. Historically, that was known as the era of good feelings. We'd survived the War of 1812. The economy was doing reasonably well. People were happy. And so turnout was very low. James Monroe was elected president. He would have been elected unanimously by the Electoral College, but one elector decided that only George Washington should have that honor. And so he cast his ballot for a Federalist. And then we start removing property qualifications and turnout goes way up. So late 1800s, from just before the Civil War till almost the turn of the century, turnout's pretty high. There were clearly a lot of issues at stake there, and that encouraged people to vote. Then early in the 20th century, the economy begins to improve and turnout falls, and then goes up again for the Great Depression. The Cold War, turnout came up and then began to fall over time, only coming back in recent years. As I said, the 2016 elections, 2018 election was highest turnout in 104 years for a midterm election. And clearly that had something to do with people's disaffection for Donald Trump. Certainly the Democrats took over control of the US House and made gains in the Senate, so people were motivated once again to show up and vote. So whether that continues in this election, we'll see. And there's some indication that it could be true, but we don't know. So here we begin to see differences in who votes and who doesn't. We have, over time, we find that women vote more often than men, and that gap has slowly but steadily grown over the years. Something to do there probably, as we'll see, with education. Women tend to be more educated than men, and more educated people are more likely to vote. On the other hand, women don't always earn as much as men, and people who make more money are more likely to vote. So, but that gap has narrowed over time, so that may have an impact. Internationally, we do not vote. Compared to the rest of the world, our turnout is very, very low. You see, we trail much of the rest of the developed world. I don't know why voter turnout was so low in Switzerland in 2015, but if we look at other countries, we see that almost every place votes more than us. We're trailing, and that's not a good thing. If people are not voting, they're either being discouraged from voting or they're feeling like it's not worth their time, and neither one of those things is good. States have to maintain legitimacy, and if people don't regard the government as legitimate, they stop obeying the laws, so that's a problem. Even in the Western Hemisphere, we trail almost everybody. Colombia and Honduras are the only places in the Western Hemisphere that vote less than we do. It's fairly appalling. Uruguay is a very happy, wealthy country, and so they vote in large numbers. Clearly, they feel the state is legitimate. Ecuador, on the other hand, is poor and has many issues, and they still have a higher turnout. Same thing with Bolivia. So these are not good numbers. This is a problem for us. Average turnout in legislative elections. So this is non-presidential elections, and other countries here again vote more often than we do. Now, one difference between the US and these other countries is that they all have parliamentary systems. So a parliamentary election means that there will be a change in government. There's less of a change in an off-year congressional election. So that may account for some of the differences. But for example, Italy, for much of that time period, they were getting a new government every year. They had a lot of political turmoil, but they had high voter turnout. how America participated in the 2016 election. We find that more than half of people didn't vote. A big bunch were ineligible, and then almost a third just simply didn't vote. And so Donald Trump was effectively elected by less than 20% of the people. That's not a sustainable result. Total percentage of the population, we do find that over time we've had higher turnout. So that's a good thing, more people participating, but still not very good compared to the rest of the world. Here's the turnout in 2016. The darker states, at least on the map, had higher turnout. We see that in the South, aside from Florida, which has an older population, we had fairly low turnout. So, and this result is replicated in other ways of looking at this, as we'll see. In particular, we find that the states where there's lower turnout, those states make it less easy to vote. So that clearly has an impact. If did not vote had been a candidate in the 2016 election, it wins, right? It wins. That's really not a good result at all. Even in Washington, where we get pretty high turnout, did not vote won. Who votes? Well, here in Washington State, who's registered? We find that the older people get, the more likely they are to be registered. Women are more women registered than men. And that seems to have something to do with, the older you are, the more settled you become, the more you're more likely to understand issues and the importance. Perhaps you bought a house and all of a sudden a bunch of things matter to you that didn't matter to you when you were 20. And that shows up pretty consistently across elections. The only time young people voted in great numbers, the numbers went up in 2008 for Barack Obama's first campaign. They were highest in 1972 when we'd amended the Constitution. 18-year-olds could vote. We were still in the Vietnam War, and those folks were clearly motivated to try to say something about that. Voter turnout by sex and age. The blue is men, the red is women. We see that women are more likely to vote, and we see that young people overall are less likely to vote. And 2008 is a fairly typical election, so this is a pretty good snapshot of how this all works. Once again, turnout by age, dividing these into quartiles, we see that 60 and up, most likely to vote, and then 18 to 29, less likely to vote. Voter turnout by educational attainment, 2008 presidential election. So the more educated people were to vote, more likely they were to vote. Less educated, the less likely they are to vote. Less educated voters are less likely to understand the system or to make the connection between voting and what happens to them. So that matches age, which would correlate somewhat. You're less likely to be 18 with a PhD. So that has an impact. Turnouts by education, same story. And true over time. You'll notice that once again, presidential years, turnouts up, congressional election years, turnouts down. By income, here again, wealthier people are, the more likely they are to vote. And that just, so on the left side, people with less money, less likely to vote. On the far right side, wealthier people are more likely to feel like they have a stake in the system. They're also more likely to be educated. So there's some overlap there. Clearly, more educated people are more likely to make a decent living. Turnouts by race and ethnicity. This is kind of interesting. The two groups that are more likely to vote here are white Americans and African Americans. And the two groups that are less likely to vote are Hispanic Americans, Latinx, and Asian Americans. I have a theory about this. I don't know that it's true. My suspicion is that among Hispanic and Asian Americans, they are more likely to be recent immigrants to the country or their families, and they may come from places where there wasn't voting or their votes didn't matter, whereas African Americans and white Americans have been here from the start of at least the European America, we could say. So more invested in the system. If we account once again for income and if we account for education, those disparities go away. This is a fuzzy slide. I apologize for that. I could not find a better copy of this, but what we see here, the dark green states represent higher turnout in 2018 among younger voters. So Washington, Nevada, Montana, Minnesota, Missouri, Georgia, Virginia, and New Hampshire saw a much higher turnout among younger voters in 2018. That being said, the kinds of candidates that younger voters often say they favor, so-called progressives, by and large did not do well in that election. So even though younger voters were more likely to show up, they may not have made as much difference as one might have suspected. Reasons why people vote and don't vote, this is kind of interesting. So we see at the top section there, common reasons why people say they're gonna vote. Why they're gonna vote more often, and the more that these things are true, the more likely they are to vote and to be registered. So they're interested in local politics, they feel it's their duty, they feel this election matters, and guilt. They feel guilty if they don't vote. On the other hand, in the bottom half here, people who know little about the candidate are less likely to vote and much more likely to not be registered, bored by what goes on in DC. Honestly, I don't get that. I don't know how you can feel that right now. Angry with government, I mean, that seems curious. If you're angry with the government, by all means, you should vote. Issues in DC don't affect me. Well, that may not be true. Voting doesn't change things. That sort of shows up a lot increasingly. People are frustrated at not seeing the change that they want, but then again, they don't vote. Sometimes too busy. That's a common thing, especially among younger people, and it's at least a little bit understandable. Difficult to get to the polls. Now that's not an issue for our state, but clearly it is an issue in some other states. Where it's easiest and hardest to vote. So this matches our earlier graphics. You'll see in the North and in the West, we've made it easier to vote. And what do you know? Those people in those states are more likely to vote. We look at the South, particularly Texas. We see that it's harder to vote. And of course, turnout is lower. And sadly, you know, we're seeing a lot of instances of where a certain party in certain states are doing everything they can to keep people from voting. So why don't young people vote? So you look at this chart, you can see that too busy and work conflicts is probably the single biggest reason why young people say they don't vote. It's coming in a second, not interested, felt my vote wouldn't count. Out of town or away from home, registration problems, don't like candidates. I find it interesting that among voters over 30, that's a bigger reason than it is for younger voters. So here again, reasons why eligible votes do not register. They lack confidence, they lack interest, they lack time, other. That's a pretty big category, so that must be quite a bunch of different reasons there. Oh, let's see here. So this, one of the ways in which people may become convinced that their votes don't count is because of gerrymandering. So the gentleman on the right of our screen is Elbridge Gerry. He was governor of Massachusetts, briefly vice president of the United States, died in office in 1814. But while he was governor of Massachusetts, after a census, he was in charge of redistricting, and he drew this map, and a newspaper artist drew a representation of the map and illustrated it such, and somebody said, well, that looks like a salamander, and somebody else said, no, that's a gerrymander. And so Elbridge Gerry gave his name to the language, and gerrymandering is drawing districts for partisan advantage. The idea basically is you take one party and you put as many of their members as possible into the fewest number of districts, and then you spread out a majority of the other party in more districts, and it makes it easier to win. So looks like this, right? If you just drew the district straight up, In this instance, blue wins because they've got a majority in each district. If we gerrymander the districts, we can take that minority and turn it into a majority in a majority of the districts. And in fact, over the last several election cycles, Democrats have gotten more votes for the US House of Representatives, but only in 2018 did they reclaim control of the US House of Representatives, despite getting more total votes. And that has to do with gerrymandering. So here's an example, Virginia. On top here, we see that in 2010, Virginia's congressional districts looked like this. It's not perfect, but clearly it's a little more compact. In 2012, Republicans took over the majority in the state legislature. They got to redistrict. They were able to draw the districts in a way which turned a disadvantage into an advantage. This has gotten to the point in some states, judges are beginning to throw out these redistricting plans because they're so clearly discriminatory. As I've said, Washington has a nonpartisan redistricting commission, and it's not perfect, but it works a heck of a lot better than this. If we were to just draw the districts by sort of trying to make them geographically compact, we'd get the map on the right instead of the existing map on the left. And while it's a little hard to see there, you would find many fewer districts that were basically salamanders. So that's that. We face some challenges in this election, of course, but I hope you will all get out and vote, and I hope you will show up in 2 weeks when we will talk about federal elections. So thanks again, everybody, and I will see you soon.